He asked for water a second time, and they humiliated him for it. Not because he shouted, not because he demanded, but because of the color of his skin. In the quiet luxury of first class, where courtesy is currency and appearances are everything, one black man's simple request triggered a chain reaction that exposed far more than poor service. It exposed something rotten, something hidden behind polished uniforms and fake smiles. They assumed he didn't belong. They made him the problem. They made sure everyone saw it. But what they didn't see coming was how fast the sky can fall when power is underestimated. This isn't just a story about injustice at 35,000 feet. It's about what happens when the system tries to bury the wrong man and fails. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? What would you have done in that cabin? And if you're ready for more stories that uncover truth, challenge bias, and never hold back, hit subscribe and stay with us. This is only the beginning. Malik Carter stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 719 with the same calm poise he brought into every room, his steps measured, his carry-on light, his mindset on quiet. He had chosen this flight for a reason. A window seat, minimal layover, and the promise of a few hours away from business calls and boardroom politics. His seat, 2A, sat near the front of the cabin, draped in cream leather and framed by polished wood finishes that screamed old money comfort. As Malik settled in, he placed his briefcase carefully under the seat in front, adjusted the angle of his headrest, and pressed the service button just once. A polite chime echoed above. He waited. It wasn't urgent. He simply preferred water over the bubbly flutes already being served to the couple beside him. They had already requested champagne twice, and now asked for a third round before the cabin door even closed. The attendant smiled, complimented the gentleman's taste and vintage, and leaned in to refill his glass with practiced charm. Malik gave it another moment. 10 minutes passed. No one came. He pressed the button again, slower this time. Across the aisle, Rachel Moore, the lead flight attendant, glanced up from the galley. She saw the light above his seat blink. Her expression remained unchanged. She turned to another attendant, whispered something, then approached with deliberate pace. When she stopped in front of him, her arms were crossed, her smile more a warning than a welcome. Her voice came low, clipped, sharp around the edges. She informed him that service would continue shortly, and that passengers were expected to be patient. Malik raised a brow, tone calm, posture relaxed. He explained he had only pressed the button twice, spread across 15 minutes. Rachel didn't blink. She responded with a tone that implied challenge rather than clarification. Then she turned and walked away. The man beside Malik cleared his throat, shifted in his seat. He was older, white, wore a navy golf shirt and gold cufflinks that glinted under the cabin lights. He leaned back, sipped his third glass, and muttered something just loud enough for those around to hear. Probably thinks he's at a diner. Rachel heard it. She said nothing. She passed Malik's row again minutes later, pouring wine for a woman behind him, laughing softly at something the woman said. Malik watched her not with anger, but with a stillness that unnerved. His fingers stayed folded. His voice remained unraised. A few rows back, a young couple glanced forward, exchanging a brief look. The man raised his brows as if to say, "Are we seeing this?" And the woman pressed her lips into a line. No one spoke. The flight continued boarding. More passengers entered, more greetings were shared. Rachel returned to the front of the cabin and addressed each new first-class arrival with warmth and curated elegance, except when it came time to pass Malik again. Then her tone dimmed. Her steps quickened. She turned away before he could speak. He didn't. Instead, he watched the contrast. He watched her offer fresh drinks to other passengers, ask if the cabin temperature was too warm, offer to take coats. None of those gestures reached him. When she passed by his row a fourth time, Malik calmly asked if water would still be available. Rachel stopped. She did not smile. She looked around first, saw the eyes on them, and then leaned in just enough to say he had already made his request, and further interruptions were not helpful. The man beside him smirked into his champagne. Rachel walked away again, this time without looking back. The tension in the row had thickened to the point it moved like humidity. She moved through first class like a curator in a museum, stopping at select rows with smiles, leaning in to listen, laughing at subtle jokes, and ignoring the weight of tension that hung in the space around C2A. When she finally neared Malik again, she didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she paused 2 rows up, served a tray of wine and hors d'oeuvres, then turned back as if only noticing him by obligation. She stepped toward his row, stopped just short of his armrest, and without a greeting or acknowledgement, spoke loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Sir, you've already made multiple requests. We ask that passengers refrain from interrupting service unless it's urgent." Her tone, though restrained, dripped with reprimand. Her posture radiated impatience. She didn't ask if he needed anything. She didn't offer the water he had initially requested. She merely left the implication hanging in the air that he was being a problem. The man beside Malik glanced over, but said nothing. Across the aisle, a woman, young, composed, with dark hair pulled neatly behind her ears, tilted her head slightly, watching the interaction unfold. She had noticed the earlier moments too. The button ignored. The drink never served. And now, this public correction masked as policy. She leaned slightly forward and addressed Rachel with calm, deliberate clarity. "I believe he's just waiting for something you forgot earlier. He's been nothing but patient." The cabin quieted for a beat. Rachel turned slowly, her smile stretched thin and brittle. "Thank you, but we're handling service, as we always do." Her gaze flicked to the woman's lapel, to the ticket tucked in the seat pocket, and then down the aisle. She didn't respond to the comment. Instead, she reached for the service cart, pulled it backward 2 rows, and called over another attendant with a curt nod. Moments later, Rachel returned and politely asked the woman to gather her belongings. "There's been a last-minute update," she explained. "For balance, we're relocating several passengers. You'll be more comfortable in the forward section of Economy Plus." The woman stared at her, unmoved. She glanced at Malik, then back to Rachel, who already motioned for her to stand. Other passengers watched as the woman gathered her things and followed the second attendant down the aisle, leaving the front cabin noticeably quieter. The message was clear. Defending the wrong person carried consequences. Malik didn't react. He shifted his weight slightly, leaned back in his seat, and folded his hands in his lap. But his eyes no longer looked out the window. They locked forward, focused, calculating. Rachel continued service, but her rhythm faltered. Something in the cabin had shifted. A few rows down, an older gentleman lowered his newspaper. Another passenger adjusted his headphones but kept one ear open. Everyone had heard the exchange. Everyone had seen the result, but no one said a word. The silence again did more damage than sound. Rachel returned to the galley where she whispered to another attendant, her tone low and firm. Her jaw tensed as she gestured toward the seat Malik occupied, then toward the back of the plane. When she did, it wasn't with refreshments or service. It was with paperwork. She passed by without a glance, then ducked behind the curtain near the galley and pulled out her tablet. With a few taps, she opened an internal crew messaging system and began typing. Her message wasn't a request. It was an official entry into the crew log, a digital record that every onboard staff member would be able to access. Subject: Passenger Malik Carter. Summary: Previous incident history noted under legacy records, potential behavior flags. Monitor. Her fingers paused, then typed one more line. Avoid escalation unless absolutely necessary. The language was careful, but the intent clear. She offered no supporting evidence, no citations, just enough ambiguity to raise a shadow. Within seconds, a soft ping reached the device of Jake Ellis, a junior flight attendant with 2 years of experience and a tendency to observe more than he spoke. Jake was currently organizing service trays in the rear galley when the alert flashed across his screen. He opened it out of habit, skimmed the words, then paused. A wrinkle formed on his brow. He looked toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, then down the aisle where he had noticed Rachel whispering earlier. Something felt off. He knew how these entries worked. Vague enough to be safe from HR scrutiny, pointed enough to steer perception. Jake tapped the screen, then hesitated. There had been no prior incident. No raised voice. No confrontation. The only thing Malik had done was sit quietly, press the service button twice, and endure being ignored. Jake leaned to the side, quietly asked one of his colleagues if there had been anything unusual up front. The answer came in a low murmur. No, nothing. Just the usual. But when Jake scrolled down, he saw that Rachel had already tagged the log for follow-up. The implication was clear. If anything went wrong during this flight, it would trace back to one seat, to one man. Jake stepped forward to ask Rachel directly. He found her near the beverage station, calmly sorting wine bottles and restocking creamers. He spoke her name, voice polite but firm. She looked up with a controlled expression, one eyebrow arched in response. He asked whether the entry had been made in error. He said he hadn't seen any disruption. Rachel didn't blink. Her voice dropped just above a whisper, clipped and precise. He doesn't need to do anything to be a problem. Jake's jaw tightened. He asked again if there had been a complaint or if corporate had flagged anything. Rachel gave him a slow, measured look. Then she stepped closer, lowered her voice even more, and said if he had questions about her judgment, perhaps he would prefer reassignment. That word settled in the air between them like a dropped coin. Jake said nothing. She walked away. The threat was clear. He understood what reassignment meant. It didn't mean immediate termination. It meant scheduling hell, red ice across Midwestern routes, fewer international legs, fewer tips, less visibility. It meant being boxed into a corner without saying a word. Jake returned to his post. The message was received. Rachel moved deliberately through first class again, now with a veneer of heightened professionalism. She checked every row, smiled at every face, except one. Every other passenger had their meals served, their drinks refreshed, their needs discreetly met. Malik, still seated with perfect posture, was given nothing. The story she was writing around him now had its hooks in the system. The tablet log meant that future crews would see his name and pause. They'd carry a subtle wariness into every interaction, bracing for conflict that had never happened. He was being coded into the system, not as a person, but as a pattern. Behind him, one of the passengers in 3C, a middle-aged man who had been working on a laptop since boarding, began to notice the discrepancy. He looked up, frowned slightly, and tracked Rachel's movement. When she served him again, he asked about the man in front. Rachel smiled, reassured him that everything was under control, that some passengers required a little more management. That was the phrase she used. Management. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The seed had been planted. The man returned to his laptop. Rachel exhaled and turned away. Malik did not turn his head. He had heard enough through the thin veil of cabin air to recognize the maneuver. Now, with the flight midair and service well underway, she moved to the next stage. Malik sat motionless in seat 2A, composed but acutely aware of the shifts occurring around him. The air felt charged with something heavier than altitude. Eyes lingered longer. Conversations hushed when he looked up. The man seated across the aisle, the same one who had laughed earlier, now glanced at him with the smug satisfaction of someone watching someone else slowly sink. Then it happened. Rachel returned to Malik's row, not with a tray or a smile, but with a clipboard in hand and a manufactured urgency in her voice. She informed him that due to a late boarding reallocation, his seat was being reassigned. She used words like operational necessity and passenger reassignment protocol, as if they meant something concrete. Malik didn't move. He asked calmly for clarification, his voice level, not confrontational. Rachel raised her tone just enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "Sir, I'm not obligated to explain every detail. This is standard procedure. If you are unable to comply, I can request intervention." The implication in her words hung in the air like a guillotine. Across the aisle, a passenger turned up his volume, pretending not to notice. Another woman glanced down at her phone, suddenly engrossed in her home screen. Malik slowly stood, collected his notebook, and lifted his bag without complaint. He said nothing further. Rachel, having won the moment, gestured toward the back of the aircraft, where an empty seat near the restrooms awaited. As Malik made his way down the aisle, the walk felt longer than it was. Each step reverberated with the unspoken weight of judgment. The cabin seemed to stretch in silence, broken only by the occasional clink of glassware and the distant murmur of laughter from passengers unaware or uninterested in what had just transpired. When he reached the rear, a flight attendant named Grace motioned him to the new seat. Her expression betrayed a flicker of hesitation, as if she had questions she wasn't allowed to ask. She had read the log, of course. She had seen the tag next to his name, and yet the man in front of her looked nothing like the problem he had been described to be. Malik nodded once, placed his briefcase under the seat, and sat. Meanwhile, in first class, a new passenger had appeared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the uniform confidence of corporate arrogance. His blazer was creased from a rush boarding, his briefcase still unlatched. Rachel greeted him with warmth she hadn't shown anyone else all flight. She escorted him personally to seat 2A. The man sat down without looking around, already pulling out a tablet and murmuring something about client files. He was late. He had not checked in on time. And yet, Rachel had held Malik's seat for him. The other attendants knew this was irregular. Seat reallocation after takeoff was rare, especially in first class. But no one said anything. Not after what happened to Jake. Not after what happened to the woman who had spoken up earlier. The cost of defending Malik had become clear. The reward for ignoring him even clearer. Malik, now seated near the engine noise and the occasional smell from the rear galley, opened his notebook again. His handwriting, once tight and methodical, had grown sharper, faster. He was no longer just documenting a single incident. He was mapping a pattern. He made note of the time, the name on Rachel's badge, the flight number, and the sequence of events. He cataloged tone, behavior, positioning, even the names of witnesses nearby. He did not write in anger. He wrote in strategy. Up front, Rachel passed through the rows with renewed energy. Her mood had lifted. She checked in on the new passenger in 2A, offered him wine, and asked if he needed assistance with the Wi-Fi. He chuckled and said something about tech problems. She laughed a little too loud. It was the kind of laugh that asked for attention. The kind of performance that came easy when you believed the audience was already on your side. But not everyone was clapping. Farther down in economy, a middle-aged woman seated across from Malik had watched the transfer unfold. She hadn't spoken, but she had seen the way Rachel had avoided direct answers, the way Malik had stayed calm, the way the cabin changed in tone. He sat composed, pen in hand, documenting not just the actions that had led to his reassignment, but the atmosphere around them, the tension, the glances, the complicity. He noticed how the cabin crew avoided eye contact, how his water request still hadn't been fulfilled, how silence had become its own kind of weapon. Just ahead, in row 21, a teenage boy with braided hair and a denim jacket had taken notice. His phone rested on his tray table, angled discreetly toward Malik. He wasn't trying to be obvious, just curious, quietly recording what he had seen unfold. He had watched Malik be removed from first class without an incident, seen the dismissiveness in Rachel's posture, sensed the off-script hostility no policy could explain. He hadn't said anything to his parents, seated next to him, but his thumbs hovered over the record button with silent defiance. Moments later, Rachel passed by with the beverage cart, her expression practiced and pleasant. She paused when she noticed the phone's position. Her smile thinned. Her tone dropped. She asked to see the device. The boy hesitated. She repeated her request, adding that recording during flight without consent was a violation of FAA protocol. His mother looked over, startled. She asked what the problem was. Rachel, still smiling, said calmly that unauthorized recording posed a security risk. She demanded that the video be deleted immediately. The boy looked to his mother, then handed over the phone. Rachel tilted the screen, tapped once, confirmed the deletion, and returned it with a thank you that sounded more like a warning. The mother asked what prompted the video in the first place. Rachel dismissed it as a misunderstanding. The cart rolled forward, leaving behind a tighter silence than before. Meanwhile, Malik had seen the interaction. He didn't move, didn't react, but a part of him registered what had just occurred, the attempt to erase the only independent witness of what had unfolded. He glanced down at his notes. He wrote another line, slower this time. One row behind him, a young girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, whispered to her father. Her voice was soft, but in the stillness of the cabin, it carried with eerie clarity. Why did they move that man? Was he in trouble? The father glanced down, visibly uncomfortable. He said nothing at first. Then he replied in a hushed tone that sometimes grown-ups do things they can't explain. The girl didn't understand. She pressed again. He looked toward Malik's seat and said only that everything was fine. But the cabin heard her question. Heads turned subtly, brows furrowed. The innocence in her voice had pierced through a room full of adults, too well-trained to ask. Malik heard it too. He didn't turn around. He simply closed his notebook and rested his hands on his lap. The damage was never in the loudest words. It lived in the careful omissions, the empty cups, the erased videos, the way a child could sense what grown men refused to speak. In the galley, Rachel leaned against the counter, sipping water as she scrolled through the crew manifest again. She tapped Malik's name, checking to ensure her incident report was time-stamped and visible to corporate. She reread her earlier entry, then added a short follow-up. Passenger was relocated for operational efficiency. Secondary issue with electronics use in cabin area resolved. No escalation. Her phrasing was clean, professional, deceptively neutral. She paused for a moment, then locked the screen. She didn't see the boy's mother, now watching her from behind the curtain. She didn't notice the man in row 17 typing out a note to himself on his laptop. What she had failed to calculate was the ripple. The seed of doubt was growing, not just in Malik's notebook, but in the minds of those who had been watching more closely than she realized. Malik stared ahead, eyes unfocused, hearing only the muffled whir of the engines and the occasional hiss of the air vents. He thought about how many times this had happened before, not just to him, but to others who had no notebook, no witness, no name that mattered once the plane landed. But something felt different this time. There was a slowness in the air, a gathering momentum. Something was building behind the silence. He remained still in his reassigned seat near the rear of the plane, his posture unchanged, his demeanor calm. But the unease that had begun as a whisper in the back of the plane was slowly making its way forward. Rachel Moore, meanwhile, stood inside the galley, staring at the screen of the crew tablet with lips pressed tightly together. Her fingers hovered over the internal communication channel as she considered her next move. From her perspective, the narrative she had crafted was unraveling too slowly, the outcome not yet satisfying, the control slipping just enough to unsettle her. And when control slipped, escalation became her weapon. With a single swipe, she tapped into the cockpit line, requesting a non-urgent priority code shift, then retyped a follow-up in bold. Cabin disturbance near row 30, potential passenger interference, monitoring required. She kept the language ambiguous, just suggestive enough to raise concern, yet vague enough to shield herself from scrutiny. Within moments, the captain responded via internal message. He acknowledged the situation, confirmed receipt, and flagged a possible early descent window in case of necessary intervention. The word intervention now hung like a silent threat inside the digital channel. Rachel adjusted her uniform, straightened her shoulders, and walked back into the aisle, eyes sweeping the rows like a general surveying a battlefield. But in reality, the only one who hadn't moved was Malik. He sat exactly where she placed him, unmoving, unbothered on the surface, but acutely aware of every move she made. 2 rows ahead, the young girl who had asked the question earlier whispered to her father again. She said the lady keeps staring at the man. The father, this time, didn't answer. He watched too. In the midsection of the plane, Grace, the younger flight attendant with soft features and quiet posture, was arranging snack trays when she overheard Rachel's earlier message. She paused, her eyes narrowing. She had been the one assigned to Malik's new section. She had watched him since he was moved. She had seen no interference, no disruption, not even a raised voice. She decided to double-check the log. Pulling her tablet from the holder, she opened the internal notes, scrolled to Rachel's entry, and reread the coded message now attached to Malik's name. Then she checked the timestamps. Every single note had been added by Rachel. No one else had corroborated anything. Grace looked toward Malik's seat. He hadn't moved in over an hour. She tapped out a short internal memo and sent it directly to the flight supervisor, noting that the passenger in question had exhibited no disruptive behavior and was seated calmly since relocation. She kept the language neutral, but direct. A few rows up, Jake, the young flight attendant Rachel had previously warned, noticed the same report. He caught Grace's glance as she returned to the front, a silent question passing between them. Did something happen, or is something being made to happen? Rachel, now near the front of the plane, approached the intercom but didn't speak. She was waiting for the captain's call. She didn't have to wait long. The cockpit door opened slightly, and the first officer leaned out, his expression unreadable. He said the captain was initiating a descent window for precaution. Rachel nodded and quietly confirmed that she would be ready to assist with security coordination if needed. That word again, security. As if Malik, who had done nothing but endure, now posed a risk simply by existing in a cabin that had turned him into a problem. In the back, Malik lifted his notebook again. His fingers moved deliberately. He had written everything he could remember, the time he pressed the button, the names he'd seen on name tags, the order of events, the silence from passengers, the shifting of tones, the false reassignment, the video deletion, and now this strange increase in attention despite his complete inactivity. Then he noticed something new. A red light above the lavatory flashed twice. Cabin call. A signal. He saw Grace walk toward it, answer quietly, then glance over her shoulder toward him. She returned a moment later, pulled out her tablet again, and this time entered her own passenger note. She wrote that the passenger in 32B remained cooperative and quiet and had not exhibited any of the behaviors previously reported. She marked her note with her initials and submitted it. The log updated in real time. Rachel saw the note minutes later. Her eyes narrowed. She tapped in a counter note, requesting that crew members defer to the lead for passenger behavior concerns. She flagged Grace's entry with an asterisk and appended a statement about team unity and procedural clarity. The language again, cloaked in professionalism, was razor-edged. Malik sat unaware of the messages being exchanged above his head, but he could feel it in the air, the rising tension, the way passengers now whispered instead of laughed, the subtle shift in the flight crew's glances. His instincts, sharpened by years of boardroom negotiations and public appearances, told him the situation had passed a threshold. This was no longer just discomfort. It was an active campaign. In first class, the late boarding businessman in Malik's old seat now dozed comfortably under a fleece blanket. Rachel brought him another drink and a second hot towel. He didn't notice anything. He didn't need to. Near the back, the father of the curious girl had finally opened his phone. Malik Carter, meanwhile, sat in the narrow seat assigned to him near the rear of the plane, still composed, but no longer just observing. He had seen enough. He had recorded enough. He had waited long enough. With one quiet breath, he reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and retrieved a slim, matte black device, identical to any modern smartphone, except for the embedded code panel on the back. He unlocked the device with a pattern known only to him and scrolled to a secure line, buried beneath layers of encrypted protocols. The call connected without a ringtone, picked up instantly on the other end by someone who didn't need context. Malik's voice, calm and unhurried, carried less than 10 words, spoken as clearly as a command. Status compromised. Proceed with Level 2 disclosure. Then he ended the call, returned the phone to his coat, and resumed his position as if nothing had happened. But the tremor that followed didn't come from Malik. It came from the cockpit. Because 3 minutes later, the captain's control panel flashed with a priority override notification, blinking red against the sea of amber routine alerts. It bore the encrypted seal of Sky One Global Aviation Holdings and the urgent directive of its chairman, addressed to the captain directly. The message read, "Immediate suspension of current course of action involving passenger Carter. Refrain from further interaction." Await further instructions from Executive Security Office. The pilot's face drained as he read it. He knew the weight of that directive. He had trained for emergencies, handled turbulence and technical failures, but nothing in his decades of flying had prepared him for a direct call from the board. He leaned out of the cockpit and summoned Rachel forward, his voice tight but restrained. She approached confidently, expecting validation, assuming her complaint about a disruptive passenger had finally triggered top-down action. Instead, the captain handed her a printout of the directive. She scanned it once, then again, her jaw slackening as the words became clear. Malik Carter was not just a passenger. He was not a misplaced traveler or an entitled flyer with an attitude. He was a federal security advisor, working with SkyOne's own internal compliance division, deployed to conduct anonymous audits on racial bias and discriminatory protocol onboard long-haul flights. And Rachel Moore had failed that test in every conceivable way. Her face went pale. Her hands, so used to smooth gestures and controlled motions, now trembled slightly at the wrist. She turned around and looked down the aisle, not at the first-class cabin, not at the other attendants, but toward the back, where Malik sat as still as he had for the last 2 hours, his notebook now closed, his eyes watching, not unkindly, but with the unflinching gaze of someone who had already made a decision. The captain asked if she had any comment to record for the report that would now be forwarded to federal oversight and corporate legal. Rachel stammered something about miscommunication, claimed she had followed protocol, cited operational judgment. The captain cut her off. The instruction was clear: step back from all direct passenger contact immediately and remain in the forward galley until further notice. Jake, who had been watching from the curtain, caught the shift instantly. Grace, positioned near the middle of the plane, received the update on her tablet seconds later and felt a weight lift off her chest. Malik had not been abandoned. He had been waiting, preparing, executing. The rest of the crew was now instructed to continue normal operations, defer all Malik-related tasks to the executive response team waiting at arrival, and refrain from altering any logs previously entered. In the cabin, nothing was announced, no chime rang out, no turbulence rocked the plane, but the mood shifted as if the plane had tilted ever so slightly. Malik, for the first time in hours, closed his eyes for a brief moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of release. Control had been re-established. Truth had been acknowledged. Several rose up. The teenage boy who had filmed the earlier incident noticed Rachel hadn't passed by in some time. His mother checked her phone and saw a SkyOne statement beginning to circulate in certain investor channels, a short internal notice confirming a security compliance review had been conducted on Flight 719 and that executive response procedures had been initiated. Malik Carter remained seated near the rear, his hands calmly folded atop his closed notebook, his breathing steady. The energy in the cabin had shifted entirely, not with noise or announcement, but through the quiet deference now showing in the posture of every crew member who passed his row. No one spoke to him unless necessary. No one ignored him either. They simply moved with the awareness that whatever had once been assumed about him no longer applied. Rachel Moore, now restricted to the forward galley, had not been seen in nearly an hour. Her removal from active duty was silent but total. And while the other attendants continued their duties with a new tension behind their smiles, none dared challenge the invisible perimeter around Malik's seat. Up front, in the cockpit, the pilot reviewed the final descent checklist, but his attention kept drifting toward the sealed envelope now resting on the console beside him. A physical document hand-delivered to his airport office days prior, marked with strict instructions not to open unless contacted by Executive Security Command. That contact had come an hour earlier. Now, as the airport came into view, he broke the seal and unfolded the contents. It was a formal notice from the Department of Federal Aviation Oversight, verifying the identity and scope of Malik Carter's assignment. But beneath the formal language and security stamps, one sentence stood out. This passenger serves as senior liaison to Helios Defense Systems, currently evaluating SkyOne's eligibility for a multi-billion-dollar procurement initiative. The captain exhaled sharply and passed the notice to his first officer, who blinked, reread it, and whispered, "This changes everything." At the terminal, while ground crew prepared for arrival, a convoy of black SUVs rolled up to the tarmac side of Gate 17. Inside one of them sat the executive vice president of Sky One Global, along with 2 legal officers and a press relations director frantically organizing talking points. A press release had already been drafted, but held from distribution. The board had not yet approved it, still awaiting Malik's decision. And everyone understood that no decision mattered more today. The flight landed smoothly, but instead of a routine taxi to the gate, the plane was guided to a private jetway typically reserved for high-security transport. Passengers exchanged confused glances but said nothing. An announcement informed them of a brief delay due to logistical adjustments. In the rear cabin, Malik stood, stretched slightly, and collected his belongings. His movements were unhurried, his presence unbothered, but there was a shift in the air around him, as if gravity itself now yielded to his steps. As he reached the jetway exit, the captain greeted him with a salute, not just of respect, but of acknowledgement. Malik nodded once, then stepped into the waiting corridor, where 3 agents in dark suits escorted him to a separate entrance. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Minutes later, on the other side of the airport, a conference room filled with executives and press members lit up with flashes of cameras as a podium was prepared. The Sky One logo stood behind it. At exactly the scheduled time, the executive VP stepped to the microphone and cleared her throat. "We have concluded that due to a severe breach of our company's values and operational code of conduct, all pending negotiations with Helios Defense Systems regarding fleet procurement are officially terminated." She paused as gasps echoed through the room. "Our organization will undergo immediate compliance restructuring. Effective immediately. Several members of our senior cabin operations team have been placed under investigation." This was not merely a reputational issue. This was contractual, strategic, fatal. Malik, now seated in a quiet observation suite above the terminal, watched the broadcast silently. He took no pleasure in the moment. He had not sought vengeance. Only truth. Only accountability. Rachel Moore, still seated in a waiting room deep in the terminal staff wing, clutched her phone as a notification lit her screen with headlines. Sky One loses defense contract over discrimination allegations. She didn't read the full article. She didn't have to. The numbers told the story. $2 billion. Gone. Not from one outburst or scandal, but from a pattern. From a culture that let the quiet dismissals go unchecked until the wrong person was treated like the wrong kind of passenger. Passengers from Flight 719 began disembarking in silence. Many looked around, piecing together fragments of the larger story. A few who had watched the earlier moments unfold now walked slower, more deliberate, as if unsure of what they had witnessed, but aware that it had meant more than they first understood. The article was accompanied by a still frame pulled from a grainy video, the image showing a tall black man seated alone near the rear of an aircraft, his face calm, his posture composed, while a flight attendant loomed nearby with an expression far less so. Within hours, the video clip, captured by the teenager whose recording Rachel Moore had tried to erase, resurfaced online, its cloud backup shared across multiple platforms with the caption, "They thought no one would notice." But the world did notice. The footage didn't scream, didn't sensationalize. It simply showed what it needed to show. A man treated with deliberate disregard, moved from his seat without cause, spoken to with measured hostility, and followed by silence from passengers too unsure or too complicit to intervene. The internet took care of the rest. Within 12 hours, the clip had crossed over 7 million views. By noon, it had doubled. Hashtags surged, articles exploded, and major news networks picked up the story with live coverage from outside Sky One's headquarters. The airline issued a second statement by midday, more defensive than the first, insisting that the incident was under investigation and did not reflect the values of the company. But it was too late for reassurances. The stock market spoke louder. Sky One shares dropped 17% in a single session, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value before the closing bell. Investors fled. Corporate partners released vague but decisive statements distancing themselves from the airline. Travel influencers posted screenshots announcing that they were canceling all collaborations. Loyalty members began transferring miles to competitor carriers. And in a boardroom cloaked in silence, the CEO of SkyOne, a man who had led the company through a decade of expansion, was asked to resign. He did so without resistance, delivering a one-sentence memo to the press that said only accountability begins at the top. Rachel Moore was officially suspended without pay pending internal review, her name stripped from active rosters, and her access to the airline's internal network revoked by sunset. She did not appear on social media. Her phone flooded with messages and mentions. Stay dark. The union representing flight attendants released a carefully worded statement, neither defending nor condemning her actions, but noting the need for structural reform and bias retraining across the industry. That same afternoon, an emergency town hall was held in a SkyOne conference room where executive leaders stood before over 200 staff and were met with a question no one had the answer to. How many other passengers have been treated like this when no one was watching? Malik Carter did not attend the town hall. He had flown to Washington by then, attending a debriefing with the Department of Aviation Oversight and representatives from Helios Defense. He provided his report, submitted his footage, detailed the actions of every crew member involved, and recommended an external compliance audit of the airline's policies, not out of vengeance, but necessity. His words were clear. If equity is not part of your protocol, then it is part of your liability. Across the country, debate ignited. Opinion pieces spilled from the pages of every major outlet. Some praised Malik's quiet resolve. Others decried the systemic failure of a brand built on prestige. At least 2 prominent civil rights organizations filed petitions demanding public hearings on racial profiling in air travel. Meanwhile, the Department of Transportation issued a federal notice requesting incident logs from all domestic carriers to be reviewed for patterns of discriminatory reassignment and behavioral flagging. Every airline took note. At the consumer level, SkyOne scrambled to salvage what it could. The company offered full refunds to every passenger aboard Flight 719, regardless of class, and issued formal letters of apology with bonus miles attached. But many passengers rejected the offers. Several who had remained silent on board now wrote open letters posted publicly, admitting regret for their silence, sharing how they had witnessed what happened and felt too unsure to act. One passenger, a middle-aged man from first class, posted a video admitting, "I saw it, I knew it was wrong, and I didn't say a word. That won't happen again." In an ironic twist, the teenager who had uploaded the video was contacted by multiple advocacy organizations offering him scholarships. His clip had not just exposed injustice, it had forced accountability. The boy's mother, when reached for comment, said he just knew what he saw wasn't right. He didn't want to stay quiet. Within days, SkyOne's competitors began adjusting their own procedures, implementing anonymous surveys, re-evaluating crew training programs, and deploying DI audits before the media could ask. A memo from one rival CEO read, "The cost of ignoring bias is no longer just moral. It's operational." In a world increasingly shaped by optics and accountability, what began as one incident on one flight had become a case study in corporate collapse. Months passed after the incident on Flight 719, but the shadow it cast did not fade. It stretched beyond the walls of the airline's headquarters, beyond the gates of the terminal, beyond the headlines that had since been replaced by new scandals, new disasters, new distractions. Yet for those at the heart of it, the story had not ended. It had only begun to settle. Malik Carter returned to his work, not with triumph, but with deeper resolve. He met with regulators, advised on new federal frameworks for bias accountability in aviation, and helped develop the first comprehensive training standard that mandated equity protocols for all crew members, regardless of seniority. His name began to circulate not as a victim, but as a catalyst. Quietly, deliberately, without fanfare, he helped dismantle the very mechanisms that had once tried to erase him. But while he moved forward, so did someone else, on a very different path. Rachel Moore, now stripped of her uniform, her title, her identity as a gatekeeper of luxury, faced the mirror of consequences that would not blink. In the weeks following her suspension, she avoided the news, deleted her social media accounts, and refused interview requests. The calls stopped. The apologies never came. She spent her days in silence, wandering between temp jobs and anxiety, chased not by protesters or lawsuits, but by the knowledge that she had lost everything over something she had once thought normal. But it wasn't normal. It never had been. And the world had simply stopped pretending otherwise. One morning, several months after her dismissal, Rachel entered the community center 3 blocks from her apartment. It wasn't a place she had ever been to before. She walked in uncertainly, clutching a folded piece of paper, the printed flyer for a local racial justice nonprofit that had appeared in her mailbox. The organization didn't ask about her resume. They asked about her intent. She didn't lie. She said, "I need to understand what I didn't." They didn't offer forgiveness. They offered space. Rachel began volunteering twice a week, answering phones, organizing storage closets, reading case files she once would have skimmed past in detachment. She sat through workshops, listened to people tell their stories, and said nothing. For a long time, she didn't speak at all. Then, slowly, she began to ask questions. She learned about implicit bias, about coded language, about how a system sustains itself not through overt cruelty, but through quiet assumptions. And in that quiet, Rachel started to change, not publicly, not performatively, but slowly, like thawing. Nearly a year after Flight 719, the organization received a request from a national broadcast company planning a documentary on institutional change in air travel. They asked for both perspectives, those harmed and those who had caused harm but chosen to grow. Rachel declined. Then she reconsidered. She said she would only participate under one condition. She wanted to speak directly to Malik, not for television, not for absolution, but for truth. The message was delivered through the appropriate channels. Malik, when he received it, read the note in silence. He took 3 days before responding. He agreed. The meeting was arranged at a moderated discussion space in Washington, a neutral location used for reconciliation forums. No press, no cameras, just 2 chairs, a table, and a glass of water between them. Rachel arrived early. She sat nervously, hands trembling slightly. Malik entered exactly on time. He wore no suit, no pin, just a gray shirt and quiet eyes. He greeted her with a nod. She looked up and whispered the words she had rehearsed for weeks. "I was wrong. I thought I was doing my job, but I see now that I was protecting something broken. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it out loud." Malik listened. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, firm, measured. "I didn't need you to say it for me. I needed you to say it for yourself." He extended a hand. She took it. They didn't talk long after that. They didn't need to. Months later, the story was shared publicly, not the footage, not the scandal, but the gesture. A still image captured during a panel where both Malik and Rachel were invited to speak, not as adversaries, but as case studies in what happens when truth collides with change. In the photo, Rachel stands off to the side, listening. Malik stands at the podium, addressing the crowd. His final words, now etched into articles, classrooms, and the minds of those who still believe in better systems, were simple. "Justice is not punishment. Justice is transformation." That single sentence redefined the narrative. It told the world that dignity didn't end with exposure or ruin. It could continue through restoration. Malik didn't return to first class after that. Not in the literal sense. He traveled less, spoke more. He worked with communities that had been ignored by corporate influence, taught young professionals how to recognize the signs, and pushed for systems that didn't just avoid harm, but protected against it. Rachel continued her work in quiet spaces. She was never rehired by an airline, but she never tried to be. Instead, she used her voice to teach others about the warning signs she once ignored. The passengers from Flight 719 would never forget what they saw. Some still spoke about it during layovers. Others carried that memory in silence. But for a brief moment, inside one metal cabin above the clouds, a story had been written. a story about silence, power, reversal, and finally, redemption. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives that challenge injustice and reveal truth. Let us know in the comments what part of this story struck you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Your voice matters here. Join the conversation